Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Pesachim Daf Ayin Zayin contains two primary sugyas. The first sugya is looking for the source that karbanos tzibor with a set time can be brought even bituma if most of the tzibor is tameh. The Gemara will show that the source for that is from the word mayed. The Gemara will see how the word mayed appears as to four separate categories of karbanos, and then the Gemara will explain why I need a source for each of them. Then the Gemara will have a lengthy sugya to try to show that our Mishnah doesn't fit with the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua, and the Gemara will resolve how it does fit with the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua, but we'll need to learn three sub-sugyas along the way. So first of all, we want to know what is the source of the halacha that karbanos tzibor that have a set time have to be brought on a specific day, that they're allowed to be brought even if the congregation is a tameh. So the Gemara had said earlier that it comes from the word mayed. The word mayed says it has to be brought on this specific time, and therefore it's brought on this mayed. It's brought. This is the mayed. This is the time you bring it. Even if there's tumah there, you bring it anyway. You don't postpone it or not bring it. So the Gemara says, where do you have the word mayed in all four categories of karbanos? So the Gemara says that a carbon pesach and a carbon tamid, those each have the word mayed. Specifically, it says b'mayadai, bring it b'mayadai. There it says mayed, we got that. Then the Gemara talks about the karbanos that are listed in Chumash Vayikra and the karbanos that are listed in Parshas Pinchas in Chumash Bamidbar. So the Gemara says the karbanos in Chumash Vayikra, it says Vayidaber Hashem is Mayadei, Vayidaber Moshe is Mayadei Hashem Ubnei Yisrael. After all those karbanos, it says, it sums up by saying that Moshe said over these Mayadei Hashem. So those karbanos are all called mayed from the fact that it's summed up with mayed afterwards. Now, which karbanos is this referring to? This is referring to the karbanos tzibor of Shavuos, which is the Shtei Alechem. There are two carbon minchas. It's also referring to the carbon ha'omer, which is brought on Pesach. That's what's included there, and all those other karbanos that are with it. Says the Gemara, the karbanos in Parshas Pinchas, there it's summed up by saying Eila tasu l'Hashem b'mayadechem, and therefore you sum up all those. Those are the karbanos of each Yom Tov. You sum those all up by calling it mayadechem, and again the word mayad applies. So you see that the word mayad applies to all four categories of karbanos: Pesach, Tamid, karbanos of Vayikra, and karbanos of Bamidbar. Now the Gemara says, why do I need to list each of these separately? So the Gemara says each one has a reason that I would think that it's stricter than the other ones, and therefore if I only said by those, then I wouldn't know the other ones. So first of all, carbon Pesach you get kares for. Carbon Tamid is brought every day, and it's completely burnt. Those two together, if I would have said them, have those two stringencies. I wouldn't have known the other ones. The stringencies of the other two, the truth is I don't really know which one is a stringency and which one is not a stringency. I could have learned each way. If I would have only said one of them, I wouldn't have known the other ones. And the stringencies are that the karbanos of Vayikra are not coming to be mechaper. They're coming just to be matir. They matir eating of grain. They matir chadash. The carbon ha'omer is matir grain which took root already before that. And if the carbon ha'omer is not brought, or anything which took root afterwards is matir by the carbon shtei alechem on Shavuos. Those aren't really mechaper anything. They don't bring any kapara. They just permit the grain. The other karbanos tzibor of Bamidbar, those are all mechaper on Klal Yisrael or even on the nations, depending which karbanos we mean. So now, which is a stronger thing, to be matir or to be mechaper? We don't know which one. So therefore, we have to list both of them, and we also have to list the carbon tamid and the carbon pesach again, because we don't know which of these would be stronger. Okay, now the Gemara launches into its next sugya. And the sugya is going to be as follows. We know in our Mishnah had said that the karbanos tzibor can be brought even bituma. The Gemara's question is that this would seem to not fit with the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua, because Rabbi Yeshua holds of one specific halacha, and we're going to assume he also holds of two other halachos, and the three halachos together make it impossible to hold that you can bring these karbanos tzibor bituma. What are the halachos? So the Gemara, first of all, quotes a machlokes between Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer. The Gemara analyzes it at length. And then we will go through what we're doing the Gemara slightly out of order, but we'll go through the other two opinions you have to hold to make it not fit with our Mishnah. So, what is the Machlokes Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer? Machlokes is as follows: if there's some psul, or if you lose the meat of a carbon and you can't eat it, or when we say eat it, we mean Kahanim can't eat it, or Yisraelim can't eat it, or the Mizbeach can't eat it. All those three things are called eating. If the meat is not around to be eaten, or the blood is not around to be put on the Mizbeach, can I do the other one? Meaning, if I have the meat, can I eat the meat if I don't have the blood? Or if I have only the blood, can I put the blood on the Mizbeach if I don't have the meat to be eaten by the Kahanim Yisraelim or Mizbeach? Can I do one without the other? Now, the same question applies with Karban Mincha. Karban Mincha comes from flour or grain or bread. And the way Karban Mincha is brought, there's no slaughtering, obviously, and there's no blood, but there are equivalencies. When you take off a handful of the flour, that's considered to be slaughtering it. That handful is like the blood, and the rest of the flour is like the meat. So if that blood, if the blood can go on the Mizbeach without the meat, that means that handful can go on the Mizbeach without the rest of the flour being eaten. And if the rest of the flour can be eaten without the blood, if the meat can be eaten without the blood being put on the Mizbeach, that would mean that the rest of the flour can be eaten without the handful, the kmitza being put on the Mizbeach. So this applies to all the sugyas. So the Gemara says that one way is a machlokes, one way is not a machlokes. Everybody, Rav Elazar and Rabbi Eliezer, I should say, and Rabbi Yeshua agree that if there's no blood, you can't eat the meat. You definitely have to have the blood in order to permit the meat. Their machlokes is, if I don't have the meat, if the meat is gone, can I do the zrikas hadam or put the handful of flour on the mizbeach or not? On that, Rabbi Eliezer says you can, and Rabbi Yeshua says you cannot. What's Rabbi Eliezer's source, and what's Rabbi Yeshua's source? So the Gemara says the psukim say as follows. It says it says before that, it says you should bring your carbon oila, the meat and the blood. That shows that the meat and the blood go together, and that's how we know that if there's no blood, you can't bring the meat. There can't be any eating of the meat, and that everybody agrees to. The Gemara says that according to Rabbi Eliezer, if I could bring the dam without the meat, why do we learn from the psukim that blood and meat are linked? It seems to be a linkage that goes both ways. In what way does it go both ways? The Gemara says that's just for referring to a different halacha. Just like the blood has to be thrown on the mizbeach, it can't be carried on the mizbeach or placed on the mizbeach, the meat is also supposed to be thrown on the mizbeach. How so? So Rabbi Eliezer holds that the ramp leading up to the mizbeach didn't touch the mizbeach. There was a slight gap between the ramp and the mizbeach itself, and the kohen would stand on the ramp and throw the meat onto the fire of the mizbeach, and therefore it's being thrown into the airspace of the mizbeach, not being placed or carried. Okay, fine, very nice. The Gemara now says, what is Rabbi Yeshua going to do with the pasuk of Adam Zevachecha Yishavech, which seems to say that there's this extra situation in which the blood can't be brought. The Gemara says Rabbi Yeshua will tell you that can't be teaching you that you can sometimes do zrikas hadam, throw the blood without having any meat around to be eaten, because right afterwards it says again, v'abasar teichel, and the meat should be eaten. So all we have is twice where the Torah links blood and meat. We don't have blood listed separately than the meat. So the Gemara says, why do you have to have it twice? The Gemara says, one is for carbon oil, one is for carbon shlamim. And the reason is because they both have astringency. Carbon oil is completely burned, and therefore it's very strict, and I may think that's where you have astringency, that you can't have blood without meat and meat without blood. On the other hand, the carbon shlamim has its own special halacha, and that's that there are two eatings. It's eaten by the mizbeach, and it's eaten by the people who brought it. So you may think that it has its own special stringency of achila, and you may think that you could eat it even without having the blood. And therefore we have to tell you twice, blood and meat are linked. You can't have blood put on the mizbeach without the meat being eaten. You can't have meat being eaten without the blood being put on the mizbeach. The Gemara asks, what is Rabbi Eliezer going to say to that? Rabbi Yeshua has a good point. It does say the words of Habasar Teichel right afterwards. How does he say that this phrase about the blood of Hadam Zevachecha Yishavech is teaching you that you could have Zrikas Hadam without meat? It says right afterwards, and you have to eat the meat. The Gemara says, Rabbi Eliezer will tell you that phrase, you have to eat the meat. Habasar Teichel is teaching you a different halacha. That's to teach you that you can't eat the meat until after the blood is brought. When you have both of them, you have blood and you have the meat, you gotta first put the blood on the mizbeach, and only then are you permitted to eat the meat. That's the proper order. That's why it says it like this. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, then you need both dam zvachecha yishafech and v'abasar. It tells you first pour the blood, and then you can eat the meat. So then it's not extra anymore. And how are you using this to teach your halacha that there's a time when you could actually put the blood on the mizbech when there is no meat? Neither phrase is now extra, and neither phrase is available for your limud. Gemara says, no, there is something else that's odd over here, and that's that the order is written wrong. The first half of the pasuk says ha-basar v'hadam, lists the meat before the blood. The second half of the pasuk says dam zochecha yishafech, and then v'basar teicha lists the blood before the meat. Why does it do that? It changes the order. It changes the orders to teach you that sometimes you could have the blood without the meat altogether, and that you could have an eating of the blood even when there's no meat. Now Rashi points out, what do you mean it had to change the order? It needed to change the order because it's trying to show you that the blood is supposed to be brought before the meat when you have them both. So Rashi says, no, the word yishafech says that it should have been, it means it should be poured, the blood should be poured, it means it should have been poured already. So we could have really said, you should eat the meat, and the blood should have been poured. It doesn't say v'adam tishbech and then go pour the blood. So I would know anyway that the blood has to be poured before you eat the meat, even if it would have first said and then v'adam yishafech. So that's why the fact that it's listed in a different order than the first half of the pasuk is strange, and that teaches me this extra halacha that Rabbi Eliezer learns from it. So now the Gemara says, now Rabbi Yeshua, where's Rabbi Yeshua going to get this halacha from? That when both the meat and the blood are around, that you have to bring the blood before the meat. So Gemara says, Rabbi Yeshua says that's a kavachomer. We compare it to the emurim. The emurim are the parts of the meat that are burned on the mizbeach. The halacha is that those parts have to go on the mizbeach before the people could eat the parts of the carbon that are eaten. Now, the halacha is that when there's no emurim, it's not a problem. You could still eat the rest of it. If something happened to the emurim, you could still eat the rest of the carbon. However, if there's no blood, everybody agrees if there's no blood, you can't eat the meat. That's for sure. Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua agree on that. If there's no blood, you cannot eat the meat. Now, so blood is obviously more important, more essential than the emurim, because you could eat the meat without the emurim going in the mizbeach, but you can't eat the meat without the blood going in the mizbeach. Yet, so we see that the halacha is that the emurim have to go before the meat if the emurim are around. Definitely, therefore, the blood has to go before the meat if the blood is around, and the meat is around. So I don't need a pasuk to teach me that the blood goes before the meat. So Gemara says, now Rabbi, what's Rabbi Eliezer going to do with that? Rabbi Eliezer says it's not a problem that there's a kavachomer for that. We know across Shas, even a halacha which I could learn from a kavachomer, though sometimes we still have a pasuk that teaches it to me, and therefore that's what this phrase is coming to teach me. Rabbi Yeshua says, okay, but if I could have a different drasha for it, then I'll find a different drasha for it, and that's why Rabbi Yeshua says that it is used for something else. It's used to teach me that you can't have blood without the meat, and you can't have meat without the blood. Those go together, and the halacha which goes first is learned from the Kal V'chomer. Okay, so the summary of all this, what we need to go forward in our sugya here, is that Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer have a machlokes. Can you put the blood on the mizbeach if the meat is not around? If something wrong with the meat, it was either lost and became pasal. And Rabbi Yeshua says you cannot. You cannot continue with the carbon. You cannot put the blood on the mizbeach if the meat is no longer around. Now, the Gemara is going to point out two other halachos, and each one has its own mini sugya. And the Gemara says that we have two other assumptions as to how a carbon brought b'tumah works. First of all, a carbon that's brought b'tumah, does that mean that the tumah no longer exists, it becomes mutter, or does that mean that the Torah says you're allowed to bring it even though you're tameh? We allow you to push the tumah off. It's dechuya, it's not hutra, it's dechuya, we allow you to bring the carbon anyway. What's the difference between the opinions? The difference is, do you need the Kohen Gadol to be wearing the tzitz in order to take care of the tumah? The halacha is that if a carbon becomes tameh while it's being brought, and the Kohen Gadol is wearing the tzitz, that you can continue because the tzitz atones for the tumah. That applies to a carbon yachid. The question is a carbon tzibur, where you're allowed to bring it lechatchila b'tumah. Is that because the tzitz is atoning for it, or is that because the tumah disappears and you don't even need the tzitz at all for a carbon tzibor. The Gemara says that this is actually a machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. And the Gemara says Rabbi Yehuda seems to be the only one who holds that the tumah completely disappears. Where do you see that? So the Gemara says that it comes from a different machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. Machlokes is, does the kohen gadol have to be wearing the tzitz in order to be mechaper for the tumah, or does the tzitz just have to be around? The kohen gadol doesn't have to be wearing it. So it says the Gemara, according to Rabbi Shimon, the tzitz just has to be around. The kohen gadol does not have to actually be wearing it. According to Rabbi Yehuda, it has to be wearing the tzitz. And this is referring to all situations in which the tzitz is mechaper, specifically a carbon yachid, where everybody agrees you need the tzitz to be mechaper. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Shimon says, I'll bring you a proof. My proof is that if the kohen gadol's avoda in the Kodesh Kodashim on Yom Kippur becomes tamei, it's okay, because the tzitz is mechaper for it. Now, the kohen gadol is not wearing the tzitz at that time, because when he goes into the Kodesh Kodashim, he takes off all the gold things, and the tzitz was made from gold. So obviously the tzitz is mechaper even if he's not wearing it. Says Rabbi Yehuda, no, that has nothing to do with the tzitz. There, the reason why it's okay b'tumah is not because of the tzitz. That's because it's a carbon tzibor. A carbon tzibor doesn't need a tzitz. A carbon tzibor is a hutra. The tumah is gone. It's taken off. Where you need a tzitz, like a carbon yachid, says Rabbi Yehuda, you have to actually be wearing the tzitz. So you see from this conversation that Rabbi Shimon holds that you need the tzitz for a carbon yachid, and Rabbi Yehuda holds Rabbi Shimon holds you need the tzitz for a carbon tzibor, I should say. Rabbi Yehuda holds you don't need the tzitz. The tumah goes off, it falls off by itself. It's like it doesn't exist. Okay, that's one discussion. The second discussion is when the tzitz is needed. Each opinion, according to how he holds, what does the tzitz work for? So the Gemara says this is a machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yossi. Does the tzitz work only for the blood, and if it's a carbon mincha, for the handful that goes on the mizbeach like the blood? But the meat, the eating part of the carbon, that would be the meat of an animal carbon and the leftover flour of a carbon mincha, but the tzitz doesn't help for that, and you can't bring that? Or does the tzitz work for both? So this is a machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Eliezer says it works for everything, even for the meat, and Rabbi Yossi says it only works for the blood or for the handful of flour. Now, the Gemara says that this opinion is a singular opinion, and we are assuming that most people generally hold, most agree, and therefore the Tan of our Mishnah should also agree that you do need the tzitz. We hold like Rabbi Shimon that you do need the tzitz even for a carbon tzibor, and the tzitz only works for the blood. Now, if we put all these three opinions together, Rabbi Yeshua doesn't fit in the Mishnah. Why? Because a carbon tzibor only works with the tzitz, and the tzitz only works on the blood. Therefore, carbon tzibor, you wouldn't be able to bring the meat. The meat would be no good. It would still remain a tamei. And Rabbi Yossi should hold, and Rabbi Yeshua, based on his opinion, should hold that if you can't bring the meat, you can't bring the dam. You can't put the carbon on the mizbeach. Therefore, it wouldn't fit with our mission that says you could continue bringing the rest of the carbon, even if you cannot eat the meat. So therefore Rabbi Yeshua doesn't fit. So the Gemara is now going to try to show that Rabbi Yeshua really fits. How so? So the Gemara has a few attempts at this. The Gemara first says that halacha that you assume that Rabbi Yeshua agrees that the tzitz only works on the blood, but it doesn't work on the meat, not entirely true. The tzitz works on some of the meat. Rabbi Yeshua holds the tzitz works on the parts of the meat that go on the mizbeach. The chaylev, the emurim, they go on the mizbeach. That Rabbi Yeshua holds that the tzitz does allow that to go, and therefore, as long as you have some meat that's kosher, because the tzitz allows it to go on the mizbeach, that's okay, and that's why Rabbi Yeshua says you're allowed to bring the blood, even though the rest of the carbon is tamei. Asks the Gemara, that's very nice for a carbon that comes from an animal, that there are three parts to the carbon. There's the blood that goes in the mizbeach, there's the fats and the emurim that go on the mizbeach, and there's the rest of it that can be eaten by the people who bring it. But by carbon mincha, which comes from flour, there's only two parts. There's the handful that goes in the mizbeach, that's like the blood, and there's the rest of it, that's like the meat that's eaten by the people. There are no special emurim and chalavim, there's no chaylev, there's no equivalent to the chaylev that goes on the mizbeach, so what are you going to say? So Gemara says, I'll tell you that Rabbi Yeshua never said his whole shita by carbon mincha altogether. He only said that you can't bring the blood without having the meat. He didn't say anything that you can't bring the handful without the rest of the flour and a carbon mincha. So Gemara says that would help, but I'm afraid it is not true. And I'm going to bring you two proofs that is not true. First of all, we have a Mishnah that says that if you have a carbon mincha, that the rest of the flour becomes tamei. Then, according to Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, it should be kosher, and according to Rabbi Yeshua's opinion, it should be pasul. So you see that Rabbi Yeshua does hold his opinion. You cannot bring the blood, you cannot bring the handful, unless the rest of the flour is kosher. So the Gemara says, could be that that's according to Rabbi Yeshua's opinion, but not what Rabbi Yeshua himself holds. According to Rabbi Yeshua's opinion in the situation of karbanos, that you can't bring the blood without the rest of the meat being kosher, so an application of that to carbon mincha would be that you cannot bring the handful without the rest of the flour being available. But Rabbi Yeshua himself doesn't hold that way. This is some other Tana who holds that way. He takes Rabbi Yeshua's opinion and goes a step further, applies it even to menachas. So the Gemara says, the problem with that is that there's no such opinion out there. There is no Tana that holds like Rabbi Yeshua and goes a step further. And the other problem is that we have a statement of Rabbi Yossi, who quotes the Machlokes Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer, and he clearly says that it fully applies both in carbon mincha and in a carbon of animals with blood. And he actually, Rabbi Yossi has a cryptic statement. He says, I agree with both sides, and he says both in carbon mincha and in carbon animals, I agree with both sides. The Gemara will explain that on a different daf, not here. But either way, we see that Rabbi Yeshua does say his opinion by carbon mincha, and therefore this answer is not going to work. So therefore, the Gemara says, okay, I'll tell you, Rabbi Yeshua argues on this entire concept altogether, the concept that the tzitz doesn't work on things that are eaten. The tzitz works on things that are eaten, it works on all the meat, it works on all the parts of a carbon mincha that are left over, anything that's equivalent to the meat. Rabbi Yeshua disagrees. You assume that he holds like the opinion that says that the tzitz doesn't work on the things you can eat. It's not true. He holds that it does, and therefore you can use the tzitz for the things that are eaten, and that's why you can bring the carbon. You are allowed to put the dam on the mizbeach because the tzitz works and it's maratza. It allows the meat to be eaten. So the Gemara says, then where is the case? And Rabbi Yeshua is saying that the carbon is pasul and you can't put the dam on the mizbeach. You can't put the blood on the mizbeach. What's the situation in which the meat is gone and therefore you can't put the blood on the mizbeach? So the Gemara says that's referring to where it either got burned up or it got lost. The Gemara says it burned up, it got lost. I just quoted you a Mishnah. The Mishnah was talking about a carbon mincha. And the Mishnah said that if the rest of the carbon mincha, the part that is equivalent to the meat that is eaten, if that part becomes tamei, according to Rabbi Eliezer it's kosher, according to Rabbi Yeshua it's pasul. I said that clearly. It also said that if it's burned or if it's lost, but it's clearly said that if it's tamei. So Gemara says, the tamei part, that was just for Rabbi Eliezer. To teach you that Rabbi Eliezer holds that it's kosher there. Gemara says, what do you mean? Why do I need that? If Rabbi Eliezer holds that if it gets lost or burned and it's totally destroyed, the carbon's kosher. Certainly if it's around, it's just tamei. If it sure holds, it's kosher. That couldn't be a chiddush. The only chiddush there has to be that even here, Rabbi Yeshua says that it's pasul. So you see clearly that when the meat and the eating parts become tamei, it is pasul. You would not say that the tzitz is meratza, that the tzitz allows you to bring that. It does become pasul and it becomes tamei. And we also have another brisa that indicates that way. It's a brisa where Rabbi Yeshua says in order to be able to bring the blood on the mizbech, you have to have either the fats or the meat. You have to have something. You can't have nothing. They have to be tahar. You can't have, if any of them become tamei, it's pasul. So he clearly says that the eating parts becoming tamei is a problem, and that the tzitz does not matter. It does not make it okay. So Gemara says, okay, we have to come on to a whole new answer over here. This will be a third attempt, and it's as follows. Where Rabbi Yeshua says you shouldn't bring the blood if the meat part is tamei, he's telling you lechatchila. You're not lechatchila supposed to bring it. If you did it, however, it's still kosher. B'di'eved, the carbon works. You don't have to replace the carbon works. You weren't supposed to, but if you did, it's okay. And our Mishnah only said that you're not, our Mishnah only said that you're allowed to do it. Our Mishnah didn't say you're allowed to do it lechatchila. It said b'di'eved, it's okay. If you did it b'di'eved, that's alright. So when Rabbi Yeshua said you're not supposed to do it, he was saying lechatchila, you're not supposed to do it. When our Mishnah said that it's no good, when our Mishnah said that it is okay, the Mishnah said it's okay, that is referring to if you did bring it b'di'eved, it's alright, and Rabbi Yeshua agrees to that. So Gemara says, not so fast. First of all, how do you know that Rabbi Yeshua was only saying lechatchila, but b'diavad holds it's okay? So first says, I have a brisa that indicates that. The brisa says if the basa became tamei or puzzle or it went outside of the zone it's supposed to be in, that's another psul. Rabbi Eliezer says put it on the mizbeach. Rabbi Yeshua says don't put the blood on the mizbeach. Again, if the meat becomes tamei, Rabbi Eliezer says put the blood on the mizbeach, and Rabbi Yeshua says don't put the blood on the mizbeach. But Rabbi Yeshua agrees that if you did, it's kosher. So you see that he holds that there's a difference. So Gemara says, I'm sorry, I'm not going to accept this. The brisa which we quoted earlier says Rabbi Yeshua says psula. Psula implies that it's puzzle even if you did do it. It's no good. And the second thing is you're claiming that our Mishnah, which said that it's good, only meant b'diavad, but the Mishnah didn't sound like it says b'diavad. The Mishnah said that there are there are 5 commandments which you can put the blood in the mizbeach. That's the lechatchila. It's saying you're allowed to go do the lechatchila. So Gemara says as follows: there's a difference between a carbon yachid and a carbon sibor. A carbon yachid is pasol lechatchila, and if you put the blood on the mizbeach, then b'di eved we say that it works because the tzitz worked on it. Carbon sibor, that's what our Mishnah was referring to when I said lechatchila you're allowed to bring it. So it works out as follows: if you have a carbon sibor, then lechatchila you're allowed to bring it, even if the blood you are lechatchila allowed to put the blood on the mizbeach, even if the meat became tamei. That's what our Mishnah is coming to teach you. In a carbon yachid, there Rabbi Yeshua tells you lechatchila you're not supposed to put the blood on the mizbeach. And the Mishnah would say, b'di eved, if you did put the blood on the mizbeach, it's okay, and nobody's arguing with anybody.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.